Could Walmart be a secret socialist plot? This is, in effect, the question that Frederick Jameson, American literary critic, Marxist political theorist, and cheeky devil all too briefly poses in a footnote to his 2005 volume, Archaeologies of the Future, a discussion of the nature of utopia in the age of globalization. Since the demise of post-war technological optimism in the 70s, Jameson finds that the once robust tradition of utopian thinking was waned considerably. The bare handful of fresh utopias that he identifies as having emerged, be it cyberpunk aesthetics or the cheerleading for corporate, corporate-old? That doesn't make any sense. Oh, corporate-led. Okay. Globalization appear wholly unimaginative in comparison to their Promethean and modernist predecessors, who did not content themselves to merely transform realms of communication and information the way contemporary utopians might. These are mere sectoral concerns, he says, rather than grander society-wide ambitions. They are not comprehensive utopias. Today's soy-distant utopias take little advantage of the genuinely new, what Jameson calls properly utopian resources available now. Bits of a better world that we could exploit are already sprouting up, yet no one seems to have noticed them. In a brief footnote, gleefully poking at the progressive consensus that regards Walmart as a globe-barnacling chain of retail hypermarkets, the Galactus of capitalism, the beau ideal, perhaps more so even than Goldman Sachs, of everything that is wrong with everything that is wrong with everything that is wrong. Jameson wonders whether he might in fact be missing a trick about this transcontinental marvel of planning and logistics. The literary utopists have scarcely kept pace with the businessmen in the process of imagination and construction, ignoring a global infrastructural development in which, from this quite different perspective, the Walmart celebrated by Friedman becomes the very anticipatory prototype of some new form of socialism, for which the reproach of centralization now proves historically misplaced and irrelevant. It is in any case, certainly, a revolutionary reorganization of capitalist production, and some acknowledgement such as Waltonism or Walmartification would be a more appropriate name for this new stage. But beyond these comments, the provocation is not fully developed. He lets the suggestion just hang there until the publication 5 years later of an essay on the subject, Walmart as Utopia. Here, he insists more full-throatedly that Walmart is not merely a useful institution from which, after the revolution, progressives could, per Lenin, lop off what capitalistically mutilates this excellent apparatus. It is not residual of the old society, he says, but rather something truly emergent of the new one yet to be born. Walmart is, quote, the shape of a utopian future looming through the mist, which we must seize as an opportunity to exercise the utopian imagination more fully, rather than an occasion for moralizing judgments or regressive nostalgia. This is no contrarian edgelord rustling of jimmies, performed simply for the lulz. Jameson is genuinely fascinated with the emergence of this novel entity that is resistant to easy categorization. He compares it to the discovery of a new species of organism or of a new strain of virus. He delights at the apparent contradiction of how the largest company in the world, even in its full spectrum dominance, indeed precisely because of this omnipotence, is described by admiring, horrified business writers as a boa constrictor slowly but inexorably strangling market capitalism. But even here, Jameson is still mostly interested in using Walmart as a thought experiment, a demonstration of the dialectical character of the new reality, and an example of the notion within dialectics of the unity of opposites, the firm as the purest expression of that dynamic of capitalism which devours itself, which abolishes the market by means of the market itself. Such philosophical arabesques are more than worthwhile, but we are curious about something perhaps a measure more concrete. We want to take Jameson's provocation beyond a footnote or a thought experiment, and in the light of what we know about Walmart's operations, revisit a nearly century-old argument between those who favored socialism and those who asserted that capitalism offered the best of all possible worlds. For beneath the threadbare cliche of the maxim that socialism is, quote, fine in theory but impossible in practice, there in fact lie claims about economic planning and about how to calculate an egalitarian distribution of goods and services without needs for markets. Furthermore, The appearance that these claims have been settled by the failure of the undemocratic Soviet Union and its satellites is merely superficial and counterintuitive, as it may seem at first. The no less undemocratic Wal-Mart and a handful of other examples we will consider offer powerful encouragement to the socialist hypothesis that a planned economy, this time democratically coordinated by ordinary working people, rather than bureaucrats or bosses, is not merely feasible, but more efficient than the market. But before we begin to explain how Wal-Mart is the answer, we first have to ask, what is the question? Since the neoliberal revolution of the 1970s and its accelerating following, let me back up. Since the neoliberal revolution of the 1970s and its acceleration following the end of the Cold War, economic planning at scale has been widely derided from right to center left, and planned endeavors such as public health care have been under attack from marketization in most countries. In most jurisdictions, the electricity systems that were once in public hands have long since been privatized. Therefore, governments committed to efforts to decarbonize electricity companies have had little choice but to employ market mechanisms such as emissions trading or carbon taxation, rather than reducing greenhouse gas emissions via democratic fiat. That is, simply ordering the electricity provider to switch to non-emitting fuel sources. Almost everywhere, transportation, communication, education, prisons, policing, and even emergency services are being spun off wholly or in part from the public sector and provided instead by market actors. Only the armed forces remain a state monopoly, and here only up to a point, given the rise of private security multinationals such as the notorious G4S and Blackwater. The handful of social democratic and liberal parties that still defend public health care and public education do so while making vague assertions that government has a role to play or that government can be a force for good. But they don't really say why. And in any case, this is making a case more for the state rather than for planning per se, even though the state and planning are far from synonymous. Social democrats today will argue for a mixed economy or for a mixture of state planning and the market. But again, they do so without saying why. If planning is superior, then why not plan everything? But if some goods and services are better produced by the market than by planning, then what are the attributes of those particular goods and services that make them so? All this activity and argument, empty of actual argument, reflects a set of policies and enacting surrender to an unchangeable status quo, the architects of which only retroactively attempt to transform such capitulation into a coherent ideology. For much of social democracy in the 21st century, beliefs follow from policies rather than policies from beliefs. And while those centrists and conservatives who cheerlead the market stop short of advocating a world where everything is allocated via markets, they still do not offer arguments explaining why their preferred admixture of market and planning is superior. When challenged, they simply describe the current state of affairs as, quote, no economy is completely planned or completely market-based. Well, plainly this is true, but again, this gives no explanation as to why their favored configuration is optimal. Perhaps this is understandable. The endeavors that epitomize planning, those of the Soviet Union and its satellites, collapsed in the face of popular opposition, economic stagnation, a militarily superior geopolitical rival, and a leadership that had all but ceased to believe in its own system. The other major Stalinist power, the People's Republic of China, steered away from state ownership, liberalized its economy, and is now the world's second superpower, while what remains of other communists with a capital C states, such as Vietnam and Cuba, are following in China's wake. It seems at first glance almost manifest that the market won the Cold War and that planning lost. Yet, if the market is conclusively, unassailably, incontestably the optimum mechanism for the allocation of goods and services, then why have the economies of Western nations continued to experience mismatches between what is produced and what is required? Mismatches. Why am I having such a hard time with that fucking word? Anyway, mismatches that have led to severe recessions and near catastrophic economic crises since 1991. Why was the global economy barely saved from a depression-scale collapse in investment in 2008, not by market mechanisms, but as a result of Keynesian pump priming? What is the source of economic stagnation since the Great Recession? Why, after 3 decades of steady decreases in inequality in the West in the post-war period leading up to the 1970s, has inequality in the developed countries grown over the last 40 years, triggering an explosion in popular anger, along with hard right reaction in country after country? Why has infrastructure crumbled and innovation stalled? Why can't the market resolve what is perhaps the greatest threat to modernity, microbial resistance to antibiotics, a situation that risks casting medicine back to the Victorian era, whereas a public sector effort likely could? And why can't the market, left to its own devices, meet the civilizationally existential challenge of climate change? So the question of market versus planning should appear as unresolved as ever. In the early decades of the last century, the question of whether the market or planning is the optimal mechanism for the allocation of goods and services was widely accepted as unanswered. In the 1920s and 30s, left-wing economists influenced by Marxism on the one hand, and right-wing economists of the neoclassical Austrian school on the other, were engaged in a vigorous discussion, subsequently known as the economic calculation problem, or the socialist calculation debate, over whether economic planning at scale was feasible. At the time, neoclassicals were not arguing from a position of ideological hegemony. The Soviet Union had recently been established, and the war efforts of both the Allies and the Central Powers were expansive exercises in central planning. By the 1930s, the Bolsheviks had rapidly launched a feudal Russia into electrified industrial modernity, while few outside the country were aware of the extent of Stalin's crimes. Meaning, economists who would criticize planning would have to counter what happened to be substantial evidence in its favor. As a result, partisans on both sides took the idea of planning seriously, and the Austrians had to work hard to try to prove their point, to show how economic planning was an impossibility. Viennese mathematician, positivist philosopher, and political economist Otto Neurath instigated the calculation debate in a series of articles following his experiences as head of the Department of War Economy in the German Empire's War Ministry. A polymath who had studied mathematics, physics, philosophy, and history, his doctorate was in the history of economics, alighting in particular on the non-monetary economy of ancient Egypt. An investigation of the 1912-1913 Balkan Wars led him to conclude that war economies are economies in kind, or what he termed natural economies. Natural economies are those in which money and markets play no role in the allocation of goods. There is no common unit of calculation, no price, and accounting instead takes place in terms of a good or service's usefulness, described vis-a-vis the magnitude of its physical properties. Neurath was also impressed by the ministry's extensive use of planning during the Great War. During the Socialist November Revolution of 1918, which would succeed at toppling the German Empire, Neurath helped draft a plan for the socialization of the economy of Saxony. Although never a prominent theoretician with the Austrian Social Democratic Party, he believed the upheaval would give him a chance to attempt a practical application of his ideas. He gave speeches on his concepts to mass meetings of miners in the south of the German province, speeches described by his friend and collaborator Wolfgang Schumann as triumphal processions. While at this time many left-wing political groups vied for power across Europe, few of them, including the Bolsheviks in Russia, had developed any schemes for the construction of a socialist society beyond slogans calling for an overthrow of the bosses and the free association of the producers. Now that the bosses were gone, how would this free association work? Many called for socialism, but few could describe in detail what that might look like. Neurath, however, began to venture beyond slogans and yearnings to give concrete form to socialism. As a result of the impression Neurath had made, the Social Democratic president of Bavaria, Johannes Hoffmann, asked him to craft and implement a central planning office for this region as well. Upon arrival, he found little more than chaos. No staff, no office, not even a typewriter. Nevertheless, Neurath and his collaborators managed to produce the first working units for an economic planning, along with more leaflets and lectures to popularize the concepts. Soon after, revolutionaries declared Bavaria a Soviet republic, but the experiment was short-lived. In May 1919, the rightist mercenaries of the Freikorps, a precursor of the Nazis, entered Munich and crushed the council government, killing some 1,000 in ferocious street fighting and a further 700 via summary execution. Neurath was arrested and condemned to 18 months imprisonment in Germany, but he was ultimately spared in an exchange with the Austrian government orchestrated by Austria's then Social Democratic Foreign Secretary, Otto Bauer. Neurath continued to be an active participant in Viennese socialist politics long after the defeat of the Bavarian Soviet, participating in the development of adult education and the city's famously successful experiments in social housing. But ultimately, he would become known for co-founding the Vienna Circle, a group of like-minded scientists and philosophers who contributed to the philosophical movement of logical positivism. In essence, an update of 19th century positivism, the assertion that all authoritative knowledge is the product of sensory experience interpreted through reason, that argued for a scientific conception of the world. He also became known for a concept he called the unity of science, the idea that common scientific laws apply everywhere and at all levels of organization, including the social and even artistic ones. But this call for a conciliation between different fields of knowledge was no defeatist departure from the political realm, still less from his notions of socialist economic planning. Neurath's plans for full socialization have been built upon theories of natural, non-monetary economies and sought to bring different types of knowledge together in order to understand and predict the complexities of the social realm. Empirical sociology, as he described it. In order to achieve economic efficiency while avoiding social inequity, the organizing structure of the new society would have to be rigorously scientific in its predictions of socioeconomic interactions. In other words, Neurath's argument for the, quote, unity of science flowed out of his recognition of the informational needs of non-market economies. But while Neurath's economic ideas today rest little better than obscure, Ludwig von Mises, Austrian school economist and hero of latter-day neoliberals, took them as deadly serious. In so doing, launching the first counter-volley of the calculation debate. In the seminal 1920 essay, Economic Calculation in the Socialist Commonwealth, Mises went beyond what by this period was already a long-standing ethical argument against socialism, that under such a system, there would be no incentive to work and therefore no drive toward excellence. In this short text, Mises instead posed the following questions. In any economy larger than the primitive family level, how could socialist planning boards know which products to produce? How much of each should be produced at each stage? And which raw materials should be used and how much of them? Where should production be located and which production processes was most efficient? How would they gather and calculate this vast array of information, and how could it then be transmitted back to all actors in the economy? The answer, he said, is that the mammoth scale of information needed for producers, consumers, and every actor in between, and for every stage and location of production of the multitude of products needed in society, is beyond the capacity of such planning boards. No human process could possibly gather all the necessary data, assess it in real time, and produce plans that accurately describe supply and demand across all sectors. Therefore, any economy the size of an entire country that tried to replace the myriad decisions from the multitude of sovereign consumers with the plans of bureaucrats working from incorrigibly flawed data would regularly produce vast, chasm-like mismatches between what is demanded and what is supplied. These inefficiencies would result in such social and economic barbarities, shortages, starvation, frustration, and chaos, that even if one accepts the inevitability of inequalities and attendant myriad other horrors of capitalism, the market would still appear benign by comparison. Meanwhile, Mises argues that the extraordinarily simple mechanism of prices in the market, reflecting the supply and demand of resources, already contains all this information. Every aspect of production, from the cost of all inputs at all times to the location of inputs and products and the changing demands and tastes of purchasers, is implicitly captured by price. But if prices in the market are so much more uncomplicated, effortless, and manageable, then why don't we just stick with them? Mises' argument in his 1920 essay, later developed through a series of books, is described to this day by his acolytes as his masterpiece. And not without reason. It is perhaps the strongest argument ever mounted against the idea of socialism. How indeed could we replace prices with planning boards? And isn't socialism supposed to be direct rule by the workers, rather than a replacement of unelected bosses with remote bureaucrats? If centralized by bureaucrats, how could all that information be gathered? And if decentralized, how could all those millions and globally billions of workers democratically coordinate production decisions? Neurath, for his part, insisted that prices in the market, as descriptors for behavior in an economy, are no less corrupted by this loss of fidelity because they fail to capture sufficient information on the material circumstances of citizens and fail to describe adequately all the costs or benefits of actions. In a system with market-based provision of healthcare, for instance, price doesn't describe information on inability to access healthcare, just as price does not reflect the impact of greenhouse gas emissions on the average temperature of the planet. There's much more to the calculation debate, and we'll briefly outline some of the additional mathematical and computational aspects later on. But for now, this theoretical standoff should suffice. It is enough to know that as a result of this impasse, depending on our political persuasions, we have opted either for the information imperfections of the market or for the information imperfection of planning, without ever resolving the debate. The stalemate could even be tweeted in less than 140 characters. What about data imperfections leading to shortages? Oh yeah, well, what about data imperfections leading to injustices? Thus we are stuck, or so it has seemed for a long time. Mises appeared to many to have turned on its head the aphorism that socialism works in theory but not in practice. He convinced many that planning did not even work in theory. The calculation problem appeared to be socialism's theoretical Achilles heel. If something works in theory but not in practice, then there's usually something wrong with the theory. But it is equally true that if something in theory doesn't work but in practice it does, then again, something must be wrong with the theory. And here is where the villainous Wal-Mart enters our story. Wal-Mart is perhaps the best evidence we have that while planning appears not to work in Mises's theory, it certainly does in practice, and then some. Founder Sam Walton opened his first store, Wal-Mart Discount City, on July 2nd, 1962, in the non-city of Rogers, Arkansas, population 5,700 people. From that clichédly humble East Bump Chuck beginning, Wal-Mart has gone on to become the largest company in the world, enjoying eye-watering People's Republic of China-sized cumulative average growth rates of 8% during its 5.5 decades. Today, it employs more workers than any other private firm. If we include state enterprises in our ranking, then it's the world's third largest employer after the U.S. Department of Defense and the People's Liberation Army. If it were a country, let's call it the People's Republic of Wal-Mart, its economy would be roughly the size of a Sweden or Switzerland. Using the 2015 World Bank country-by-country comparison of purchasing power parity, GDP, we could place it as the 38th largest economy in the world. Yet, while the company operates within the market, internally, as in any other firm, everything is planned. There is no internal market. The different departments, stores, trucks, and suppliers do not compete against each other in a market. Everything is coordinated. Wal-Mart is not merely a planned economy, but a planned economy on the scale of the USSR, smack in the middle of the Cold War. As we'll see, Wal-Mart's suppliers cannot really be considered external entities, so the full extent of its planned economy is larger still. According to Supply Chain Digest, the business management periodical more engrossing than a Vice expose on the furry fetish web porn habits of the leadership of ISIS, Wal-Mart stocks products from more than 70 nations, operating some 11,000 stores in 27 countries. TradeGecko, an inventory management software firm, describes the Wal-Mart system as, quote, one of history's greatest logistical and operational triumphs. And they're not wrong. As a planned economy, it's beating the Soviet Union at its height before stagnation set in. Yet, if Mises and friends were right, then Wal-Mart shouldn't exist. The firm should long since have hit their wall of too many calculations to make. Moreover, Wal-Mart is not unique. There are hundreds of multinational companies whose size is on the same order of magnitude as Sam Walton's behemoth, and they too are all, at least internally, planned economies. Business writers in awe of the company say that the logistical success is ultimately a product of the obsession of Sam Walton with cost savings, even minor ones, and his use of this advantage to lower prices, increase volume, and thus enable still further cost savings via expanding economies of scale. While such cost savings are a necessity for all companies, perhaps Walton's single-mindedness in this regard played some role beyond the usual. What we can say is that the company made a turn toward modern logistics long before many other large firms, and that it has been a trailblazer in logistic innovations that drive down costs. In 1970, the company opened its first distribution center. 5 years later, the company leased an IBM 370/135 computer system to coordinate stock control, making it one of the first retailers to electronically link up store and warehouse inventories. It may seem strange now, but prior to this, stores were largely stocked directly by vendors and wholesalers rather than using distributors. Large retailers sell thousands of products from thousands of vendors, but direct stockage, sending each product directly to each store, was profoundly inefficient, leading to regular over or understocks. Even smaller retailers who cannot afford their own distribution centers today find it more efficient to outsource distribution center functions to a logistics firm that provides this service for multiple companies. Think of when you go to your favorite indie vinyl revival record shop and the eyebrow-raising Jack Black and high-fidelity shop assistant says they cannot get a particular record because their distributor does not carry that album, and you think to yourself, but I know this record is available. It came out last month on Hello Kitty pencil case records. That's why logistical outsourcing happens. It would be far too expensive in terms of labor costs for one tiny store to be able to maintain a commercial relationship with thousands of record labels and vice versa. But that store can have a relationship with, say, 5 distributors, each of whom have a relationship with, say, 100 labels. The use of distributors also minimizes inventory costs while maximizing the variety that a store can offer, at the same time offering everyone along the supply chain a more accurate knowledge of demand. So while your local shop may not carry albums from Hello Kitty pencil case records via the banal magic of distributors, your tiny local shop will have a relationship with more record labels than they otherwise could. In 1988, Procter & Gamble, the detergents and toiletries giant, introduced the stocking technique of continuous replenishment, partnering first with Schnuck Markets, a chain of St. Louis grocery stores. Their next step was to find a large firm to adopt the idea, and they initially shopped it to Kmart, which wasn't convinced. Walmart, however, embraced the concept, and thus it was that the company's path to global domination truly began. Continuous replenishment is a bit of a misnomer, as the system actually provides merely very frequent restocking from the supplier to the distributor and thence the retailer, in which the decision on the amount and the timing of replenishment lies with the supplier, not the retailer. Again, you might be asking, how is this an innovation, and why would it make such a difference? You might also be asking, why does it now seem like I'm reading a god-awful capitalism filleting airport business book? Suck it up. Socialism is all about logistics, comrade. The technique, a type of vendor-managed inventory, works to minimize what businesses call the bullwhip effect, the free market's kissing cousin to Stalinism's shortage problem. First identified in 1961, the bullwhip effect describes the phenomenon of increasingly wild swings in mismatched inventories against product demand, the further one moves along the supply chain toward the producer, ultimately extending to the company's extraction of raw materials. Therein, any slight change in customer demand reveals a discord between what the store has and what the customers want, meaning there is either too much stock or too little. To illustrate the bullwhip effect, let's consider the too little case, although the phenomenon works identically in either scenario. The store readjusts its orders from the distributor to meet the increase in customer demand, but by this time, the distributor has already bought a certain amount of supply from the wholesaler, and so it has to readjust its own orders from the wholesaler, and so on through to the manufacturer and the producer of the raw materials. Because customer demand is often fickle and its prediction involves some inaccuracy, businesses will carry an inventory buffer called safety stock. Moving up the chain, each mode will observe greater fluctuations and thus greater requirements for safety stock. One analysis performed in the 1990s assessed the scale of the problem to be considerable. A fluctuation at the customer end of just 5%, up or down, will be interpreted by other supply chain participants as a shift in demand of up to 40%. Just like the wave that travels along an actual bullwhip following a small flick of the wrist, a small change in behavior at one end results in massive swings at the other. Data in the system loses its fidelity to real-world demand, and the further you move away from the consumer, the more unpredictable demand appears to be. This unpredictability in either direction is a major contributing factor to economic crisis as companies struggle or fail to cope with situations of overproduction, having produced much more than they predicted would be demanded and being unable to sell what they had produced above its cost. Insufficient stock can be just as disruptive as overstock, leading to panic buying, reduced trustworthiness by customers, contractual penalties, increased costs resulting from training and layoffs due to unnecessary hiring and firing, and ultimately loss of contracts, which can sink a company. While there is, of course, a great deal more to economic crises than the bullwhip effect, the inefficiencies and failures produced by the bullwhip effect can be key causes, rippling throughout the system and providing instability in other sectors. Even with modest cases of the bullwhip effect, preventing such distortions can allow reduced inventory, reduced administration costs, and improved customer service and customer loyalty. The product you want is right there, ma'am. No need to keep checking other stores. You can always trust us to have what you want. Make sure you come back to us first next time, ultimately delivering greater profits. But there's a catch. A big one for those who defend the market as the optimal mechanism for allocation of resources. The bullwhip effect is, in principle, eliminated if all orders match demand perfectly for any period. And the greater the transparency of information throughout the supply chain, the closer this result comes to being achieved. Thus, planning and above all, trust, openness, and cooperation along the supply chain, rather than competition, are fundamental to continuous replacement. This is not the kumbaya analysis of two socialist writers. Even the most hard-hardened commerce researchers and company directors argue that a prerequisite of successful supply chain management is that all participants in the chain recognize that they all will gain more by cooperating as a trusting, information-sharing whole than they will as competitors. The seller, for example, is in effect telling the buyer how much he'll buy. The retailer has to trust the supplier with restocking decisions. Manufacturers are responsible for managing inventories in Walmart's warehouses. Walmart and its suppliers have to agree when promotions will happen and by how much, so that increased sales are recognized as an effect of a sale or marketing effort and not necessarily as a big boost in demand. And all supply chain participants have to implement data sharing technologies that allow for real-time flow of sales data, distribution center withdrawals, and other logistical information so that everyone in the chain can rapidly make adjustments. We hear a lot about how Walmart crushes suppliers into delivering at a particular price point, as the company is so vast that it is worth it from the supplier's perspective to have the product stocked by the store. And this is true. Walmart engages in what is called strategic sourcing to identify who can supply the behemoth at the volume and price that is needed. But once a supplier is in the club, there are significant advantages. Or perhaps in the club is the wrong phrasing. Once a supplier is assimilated by the Walmart board, might be better. One is that the company sets in place long-term, high-volume strategic partnerships with most suppliers. The resulting data transparency and cross-supply chain planning decrease expenditures on merchandising, inventory, logistics, and transportation for all participants in the supply chain, not just for Walmart. While there are indeed financial transactions within the supply chain, resource allocation among Walmart's vast network of global suppliers, warehouses, and retail stores is regularly described by business analysts as more akin to behaving like a single firm. Flipping all this around, Hua Li, a Stanford engineering and management science professor, describes how the reverse can happen within a single firm to deleterious effect. Volvo, at one point, was stuck with a glut of green cars. So the marketing department came up with an advertising and sales wheeze that was successful in provoking more purchases by consumers and reducing the inventory surplus. But they never told manufacturing. And so, seeing the boost in sales, manufacturing thought there had been an increase in demand for green cars and cranked up production of the very thing that sales had been trying to offload. The same phenomenon occurs in retail as much as it does manufacturing, with Toyota being one of the first firms to implement intra and inter-firm information visibility through its Walmart-like Kanban system, although the origin of this strategy dates as far back as the 1940s. While Walmart was pivotal in developing of supply chain management, there are a few large companies that have not copied its practices via some form of cross-supply chain visibility and planning, extending the planning that happens within a firm very widely throughout the capitalist marketplace. Nevertheless, Walmart may just be the most dedicated follower of this firmification of supply chains. In the 1980s, the company began dealing directly with manufacturers to reduce the number of links within and to more efficiently oversee the supply chain. In 1995, Walmart further ramped up its cooperative supply chain approach under the moniker Collaborative Planning, Forecasting, and Replenishment, or CPFR, in which all nodes in the chain collaboratively synchronize their forecasts and activities. As technology has advanced, the company has used CPFR to further enhance supply chain cooperation, from being the first to implement company-wide use of universal product barcodes to its more troubled relationship with radio frequency ID tagging. Its gargantuan satellite-connected retail link database connects demands forecasts with suppliers and distributors. Let me back that up. Its gargantuan satellite-connected retail link database connects demand forecasts with suppliers and distributes real-time sales from from cash registers along the supply chain. Analysts describe how stockage and manufacture is quote unquote pulled almost moment to moment by the consumer rather than pushed by the company onto shelves. All of this hints at how economic planning on a massive scale is being realized in practice with the assistance of technological advance, even as the wrangling of its infinities of data, according to Mises and his co-thinkers in the calculation debate, are supposed to be impossible to overcome. Okay, it's getting a little dark. So what's up? What's up, Jason? What's going on? Sinatra, Tarantino, Nestor Urbina, Goku loses to a heart virus. Interesting. And a soulless druid. It's called Parasitic Business Practices. So this book I'm reading is by Lee Phillips and Michal Rozworski. It's called People's Republic of Walmart: How the World's Biggest Corporations Are Laying the Foundations for Socialism. It's a really good book. I found this book while watching a video from Second Thought, because he's got a whole video on basically how we could run the United States economy like Walmart runs its business. So I just feel like being a socialist myself, socialist/communist, one of the major questions that I've been asking and trying to ask other socialists who haven't provided a satisfactory answer thus far is, what would socialism or communism look like in the 21st century? What's going on, Lucifer? I appreciate it, buddy. I love that you love my videos. That's what's up, dog. I'm gonna keep doing them. But yeah, so I've been asking other socialists, what would socialism/communism look like in the 21st century? Because obviously where socialism was tried before, it was like in the 1800s and whatnot. And so obviously the world has changed significantly since the 19th century. So I just want to know, what would socialism in a late stage capitalistic economy look like if we're trying to, transition from one to the other? Now, to be honest, I don't think we'll ever get there, but I still think the effort is worthwhile. And therefore, I'm reading as much as I can, trying to learn as much as I can about alternatives to capitalism, and more specifically, what a 21st century socialistic or communistic economy could look like. And so until I have an adequate answer to that question, I'm going to keep doing more and more research. Throw your hands in the air, throw your hands in the air, throw your hands in the air to stick up. I would imagine less taxes and a government that isn't predatory in just that way. Well, Yeah, you know what I mean? Like, I don't mind being taxed. I just don't like my taxes. I don't like so much that I don't have a whole lot of say on how my taxes are used. You know what I mean? How is the tax money appropriated? And right now, I'm in complete disagreement with the way our tax dollars are being used, specifically to fund proxy wars when we have our own goddamn problems right fucking here. But you can't tell that to these neoliberals. And by neoliberals, I mean motherfuckers like Nancy Pelosi and Chuck Schumer and Kevin McCarthy and Mitch McConnell and Donald Trump and Barack Obama and Hillary Clinton. All these neoliberal fucking war criminal garbage pieces of shit have no interest in changing the status quo. None at all. So, fuck them. But anyway, I'm about to get off here. I need some coffee. I'm gonna holler at y'all. Thanks for watching, and we'll read more later. Peace.